Hi, my name is Patricia Fisher, and I am the principal percussionist with the Livonia Symphony, the Rochester Symphony, and the Motor City Brass Band, all in the state of Michigan. These videos are meant to show people who are interested in what the various kinds of percussion instruments they can see and find in an orchestra or a concert band. This is not going to be advanced demonstrations. This is meant for middle school, elementary school children, maybe people trying to get music merit badges in the Scouts, or people who just generally wanted to see what was really going on back there with all those people standing behind the string players, but we can't see what they're actually doing. So this is going to be very basic demonstrations. Here we go. So I'd like to categorize percussion in 3 different ways. There are things with skins, which are called membranophones, which means membrane phones. Skins are membranes. Metal instruments, like triangles and cymbals. And then wood instruments, like wood blocks, temple blocks, things like that. So this video is going to be about the membranophones, the things with skins. Here is a snare drum. It's a pretty basic snare drum. It has a top head, which is a membrane made out of plastic. A bottom head, which is also a membrane made out of thinner plastic. And the fact that it's clear and this is not clear has a little something to do with the sound, but not as much as you would think. It's mostly about the thickness of the head on both sides. And this particular snare drum has rims and lugs all around it and has a snare strainer, which has snares running down the bottom. There's the snares right there. Right now the snare strainer is loose, so you can kind of see the snares dangling there. But when I tighten them, the snares come real tight up against the head. And then when I loosen it, the snares dangle again. Hopefully you can see that. This is a snare drum, which generally comes from military marching or military bands. But it was brought into the orchestra because composers wanted to emulate or produce a military sound in the pieces that they were making. But now the snare drum is used in all sorts of different things, not just in military sounding music now. That's why it has snares on it. So let's take a listen to it. This is without snares. And this is with snares. Without snares. With snares. And you can see I'm manipulating the handle here, which brings the snares up and then brings the snares down again. So I'm in Michigan, and Michigan is car country. All the major automobile companies are here. My father used to be a car engineer, and he used to say, if you treat your machines well, they will treat you well as well. So that means that you have to be careful and make sure that the mechanics of the drum are working the way they're supposed to. So you might have to put a little grease or lubrication in the snare strainer so that it moves smoothly up and down. You might have to make sure that the snares are attached properly. Sometimes the strings or the plastic band tape that they use to attach the snares stretches out, so you might have to replace that. You might have to do things where you adjust the head. This is a tuning key or just a drum head key that fits. You see here the lug has a square head on it. The drum key has a square notch in it. Place that in there and tighten it or loosen it depending on how tight or loose you want the heads to be. And that same goes for here as it does for the back of the snare drum. Now all drums that are made with 2 heads like this usually have air holes in them, and that's because inside the shell there's a column of air. When you hit the top head, the column of air vibrates and moves, and also vibrates and moves the back head, which is why the snares are on the bottom side of the drum. So when you turn them on, the top head vibrates the air column, and the air column vibrates the bottom head, which vibrates the snares on the bottom of the head. So these heads, like I said before, were made from plastic. This particular head is what they call a fiber skin Renaissance head. And so they've made by plastic, and then they put a special coating on it so that the sound is darker and emulates the sound of a natural hide head. way back 1910, 1920, 1930, even way before that, 1700s, 1600s, drum heads were made from the hide of animals. Now, it totally depends on what country you're in, what kind of animal hide you had available to you. It could be bovine or cow. It could be goat. It could be elephant. It could be any kind of head at all. So what does an actual real hide head look like? So here's a hide head that came off a drum of mine that had split, so I had to pull it out of the drum. And when I pulled it out of the drum, it also shredded off of the ring. This is a metal aluminum ring. In the old days, they would use wood. And as you can see right now, because this head is so dry, it kind of sounds and feels like stiff cardboard. But to put a new head on, you'd get it really wet and gooey. In the newer time, they would use these aluminum hoops, but in the older times, they would take the wood hoop, get the head really loose and gooey, and then wrap the head around the wood hoop and let it dry until it got to this state, and then you'd have a drum head. So a lot of instruments still come with these natural heads. For instance, the tambourine. This tambourine has a natural head on it that I've painted with some polyurethane so that the head is not as affected by the weather. Because that is one thing that happens with these natural heads. If it's raining and really humid outside, the head drops and gets very loose because it's a natural substance and it absorbs the moisture. So this is a tambourine. It's a single-headed drum with jingles attached to it. Again, with a natural head on it. Now, this was brought in from Turkish music and various Eastern European music. Some of the composers, such as Dvorak and other composers like Dvorak, started using music that came from their actual region. Some people might call it ethnic music from their region. And what they were hearing in the popular music of that time was people playing instruments like a tambourine. Or, in this case, this is a single-head tambourine that unfortunately cracked because the head got really dried out and cracked, the shell. They might use a hand drum, which would be a single-headed shell like this with half head on it, with no jingles. Another example of this in a larger size would be an Irish bodhrán. Single shell, single head, big drum. They would play it with a stick like this, but no jingles, and it would sound like that. Now, tambourines can also come with double jingles. And the jingles can be made out of all sorts of metal. This particular set is made out of German silver. This set is made out of an aluminum alloy German silver. And you can also see that the shape of the jingles on these two tambourines is very different. And that also lends to the difference in the sound you're hearing. So one of the really nice things, I think it's really cool actually, about being an orchestral percussionist is that you get to play a lot of different types of percussion instruments that aren't part of the European music history. And they come from all sorts of different cultures and ethnicities. For instance, these natural heads, and if you can see here, this says it's Contemporânea from Sao Paulo, Brazil, actually came off of a cuica, which is a Brazilian instrument that I have. So we get to play all sorts of different Brazilian instruments, African instruments, with natural heads, conga drums, bongos, cuicas, panderos, which is a tambourine-like instrument that comes from Brazil. Many, many different kinds of instruments. Now this particularly happens to be a set of African congas. I'm not sure exactly which country in Africa it comes from. But this particular set of bongos, is made out of clay. Because this particular region in Africa doesn't have a lot of wood to make shells out of. So they actually make these clay pots. And then, if you can see really closely, they wrap a natural skin. I'm not even sure what animal this came from. A natural skin, and then they tie it, if you can see closely with the webbing here, they tie it down, all the way down to the bottom of the shell with leather, natural strips of leather. And this instrument sounds sort of like this. Definitely sounds like bongos. Really tight, even though it's raining here in Michigan today, and I'm kind of really happy that this drum is holding up and not, the heads aren't getting loose because of the moisture in the air. So the really nice thing is that we get to play all sorts of cultural instruments as well, including things like bongos. But again, natural head, membranophone. So let me show you another drum now. So the last drum in the percussion section I want to talk about is the big bass drum. Now this bass drum would normally be on a stand, but I've set it up on a stool, so I got it up and into the picture frame so you could see it. This bass drum is 28 inches in diameter, which for concert bass drums is kind of small, actually. So let's talk a little bit about taking care of a bass drum. Now, I've said previously that if you treat your machines right, they will treat you right. And like any other percussion equipment, a bass drum is a form of machine. It has tuning rods here that let you tighten and loosen the head. And if you can see, the rod goes all the way across to the back of the head. This is a single tension bass drum, which means that when I tune or adjust this handle here, it affects both sides of the drum, the front head and the back head. And this drum does have two heads. Front head has the T handles on it for tuning, and the back head is here. Now this is a very old drum that I happened to find in a music shop that cost me 20 bucks, and I refurbished it. I stripped it. It was painted white. I stripped it down, got new paint on it, and I uncovered, if I can find it here. There we go. I uncovered this nameplate right here. You can probably barely see it. It's a little covered over by the lacquer I used. It says Slingerland. Now, based on this nameplate, I was able to send a picture of this to a Chicago drum store who told me that this bass drum was made somewhere between 1910 and 1925, which means that this is a 100-year-old bass drum. So let's talk a little bit about heads. So these bass drum heads, even though this one is a 28-inch one, and as I said previously, most concert bands and orchestras use bass drum heads that are much larger in diameter, somewhere between 30 to 36 inches, which would be somewhere about like in here. These bass drum heads are very expensive. This head could cost $100. The larger drums could go $100 to $150, depending on what brand and what make you get. So you don't want to try to like bang on a concert bass drum as hard as possible with, say, with a snare drum stick, for instance, because you might dent or break the head. And that's $100 that your band may not have, in which case you're out of a bass drum. So let's look at some of the mallets that you would normally use on bass drum. So this is a timpani stick. It's a Vic Firth timpani stick. It's a T3 staccato, very old version. This is for timpani. It's felt covered and it's got a very small head. For special sound effects, you might use it on a bass drum, but it's not the normal stick you use on a bass drum. Bass drum sticks, bass drum mallets is what we really call them, come with very large felt covered heads. And inside this felt covered head, there might be more felt, there could be yarn wrapped on the inside, and there's a wood center in the very center of it. This is a Thomas Geiger bass drum mallet from a long time ago. I think they still make them, but I believe the Vic Firth company makes them now. So you want to have the felt head, and you want to use the felt head, the felt part, to play the bass drum. See how nice and low and boomy the bass drum is? So there's all sorts of felt sticks you can use on a bass drum. For instance, this one's kind of big and round. Well, let's look at another model from Thomas Geiger. Same kind of round head, but it's much smaller than this one, but definitely not as small as a timpani stick. This one would get a little bit different sound, maybe a little bit more staccato. still really low sound. Then they also make a pair of sticks that were meant to be used as rollers, so you had a matching set pair. Again, notice round, felt on the heads, to roll. You might roll this way. Very boomy sounding like timpani, but doesn't really actually have a definitive pitch to it like timpani would have. Then there's this kind of stick, the two-ended stick. Now, back in John Philip Sousa's era, and probably up until the 1950s, it was very common to have the bass drum player also play cymbals at the same time. They would attach a cymbal upside down onto the drum using a special attachment, take the other cymbal in their hand, and they would play like this. But what happens if you need to make a roll and you've only got one hand free? Double-ended mallet would let you do that. This is a very good skill to have if you're going to be a bass drum player, because some bands and orchestras, especially as you get older and out of school, don't have enough players to cover everything. So this allows one person to do both bass drum and cymbals together. So another thing you need to think about, and I see this in a lot of high schools where I go and play, that the band directors, or middle school or elementary school, the band directors have large pieces of felt that go across their concert bass drum. And the reason they do that is because they don't think that the player knows how to dampen the bass drum properly. Because, again, watch this. Still ringing, still ringing, still ringing. Well, what if the band has a really short note, like that? You don't want to hear that, because that takes away from the shortness of the note. So one of the things you need to learn how to do as a bass drum player is know when to dampen the bass drum. For instance, if it's a short note, I would do this. Now, just in case you didn't notice, I have my hand here on the back head as well as on the front head. So when I hit the bass drum, both hands are dampening it. And just like all the other drums, like the snare drum that had two heads as well, what goes on here is that when you hit the first head, there's this space between the two heads from the shell, and all the air in that space is moving because I hit the first head, and it also makes the back head move, which is why when you dampen, you got to use your hand on that back head as well, which is also another reason why they have an air hole in a lot of these drums. Because if you hit it, some of the air puffs out of the hole, but enough of the air vibrates the back side of the head, and it makes the sound. Okay, I hope that you've enjoyed me showing you all the different sounds and drums, membranophones, or things with skins that you would see in an orchestra. I'd like to thank the Livonia Symphony for sponsoring this video, and keep practicing and check out for some other videos that we have coming on other instruments, but including more percussion instruments. And keep practicing, and bye for now.